Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Iyar, and I'm podcasting from Ma'ale Adumim in Israel. Among the primary goals of virtually all modern democratic societies is the magnificent quest for liberty. This word, along with its twin, freedom, is enshrined in almost every mission statement of a modern enlightened government or organization. It is difficult to imagine anyone today not placing liberty at or near the top of their personal and global goals. It is so basic to human life that any debate on its validity as a humanitarian aim is no longer possible. It is the most famous quote from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It figured prominently in the early declarations of the French Revolution. Any politician or moral philosopher has to mention freedom or liberty at some point in their repertoire of speeches or books. Advocates of all sides of the political and moral debate have to claim it as one of their primary agendas in pushing whatever it is they push. The interesting thing about freedom and liberty is that the more we have of them, the less we think we have. Back in the prehistoric times of feudalism and serfdom, nobody had any freedom except those at the top of the heap. Anybody else was limited by their position in society, which for the most part was absolutely fixed with no chance of rising above one station. This was simply the way things were because that was the way God made them. It was only in the late 18th century that things began changing. Freedom and liberty were on everybody's lips, even if things remained largely the same. But once they were tasted at all, there was no going back to the good old days. The various political and social movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries instilled this goal firmly in the Western mind. Even totalitarian societies promised to bring liberty in some way. One of the main political battles of the 20th and 21st centuries is which side is really pro-liberty and which side is against it. But as more and more freedoms were accumulated by larger swaths of a given society, the less satisfied they became with how much they had. When they had none, they didn't think they were missing anything. When they had some, they wanted more. When they had a lot, they were increasingly convinced that they actually had none. It's a bit like junk food. When we don't have it, we may not miss it. But when we have it, we can't get enough. There is an easy explanation for this apparent paradox. Liberty is a great thing. It may not be essential for life, but it certainly makes living much better. But with freedom and liberty comes the ability to think differently and to imagine more possibilities. Once that door is opened, it cannot be shut. When the imagination is allowed the freedom to roam, it will go wherever it wants. It will never be satisfied with remaining static. If we have no freedom, we cannot see ourselves as anywhere but where we are. If we have freedom, we always want to be someplace else. It is difficult to say if freedom and liberty were or are the goals of religion. One can certainly find enough quotes from primary religious texts to back up the position that whatever religion they are promoting is a big supporter of liberty. But when one looks at the history of religion and examines some of their central purposes, one may find the exact opposite. Religions tend to push conformity in both actions and beliefs. Any shirking of authority is seen as an act of rebellion. Revolutionaries of all stripes who invariably pushed liberty as their main agenda have always been fully aware that among their fiercest enemies is the authority of religion. Today, the liberal mindset almost invariably sees traditional religion as a regressive force. Who's right? Is religion a liberator or a restrictor? This week's Parsha is called Behar, which means on the mountain, referring to Mount Sinai. The title really has nothing to do with the contents of the Parsha other than the fact that the laws described were given at Mount Sinai. It is a rather short Parsha with one main subject which contains a few spin-offs. That subject is primarily agricultural, but it branches off into other arenas. The agricultural topic is commonly called Shemitah, which means remittance or something like that. But the word Shemitah doesn't actually appear in the Parsha. Instead, it describes the concept of the resting of the land. This is known in Hebrew as Shabbat Haaretz, which includes, of course, the word Shabbat. Shabbat means rest, and here it is being applied to the land of Israel. The Torah expands this commandment of resting the land, which had only been hinted at earlier. The main scope of this commandment is unsurprisingly agricultural. Resting the land means not working it. It means no planting and no pruning. Even harvesting is to be done under somewhat controlled conditions. One can only gather in what one was prepared to eat on a relatively immediate schedule. Not only that, but every person had equal rights to harvest in this manner, regardless of whether the field or the produce was privately owned. While this may sound counterproductive on many levels, it did have its rationale. On the most practical level, this was a way of replenishing the soil. Every 7 years, the ground could not be planted, enabling the soil to restore some of the nutrients that were lost during the 6 years of normal agriculture. As far as the allowance for anyone to gather produce, even from land that wasn't theirs, this was to instill in the minds of the Israelites the idea that the land did not really belong to them at all, even if they owned it as an ancestral plot. It belonged to HaShem. This was such a central point that essentially this entire parsha revolves around it. We don't own the land. God does. What could be simpler? Judaism has a long-established tradition to refer to this 7th year of rest as the Shemitah year, based on a related law that applies to it dealing with the remittance of debts, which comes up in the book of Deuteronomy. Judaism also has a well-established tradition as to when the Shemitah year occurs. We are currently in the 2nd year of the 7-year Shemitah cycle. While there has been debate historically over how to count the years of the cycle, and the current consensus is that we no longer are obligated to count it at all except as a rabbinic injunction, things have now settled down to a fairly accepted pattern, and Shemitah no longer produces any great surprises or major challenges. One of the spin-offs of Shemitah mentioned in the Parsha is the related concept of Yovel, or Jubilee year. This comes at the end of 7 Shemitah cycles and is thus the 50th year of the cycle. In addition to the normal agricultural restrictions of the Shemitah year, there is the additional requirement that that ancestral land that was purchased by an outsider must be returned to its ancestral owners or their heirs. The idea is that the land cannot be sold in perpetuity, since again, we are only temporary residents upon it. Those ancestral owners are, in a sense, God's representatives in holding on to the land. Another requirement of the Jubilee year is the emancipation of slaves. Slaves, for better or worse, were a solid fixture in biblical society and of most societies until the most recent couple of centuries. But the Bible adds this provision that once every 50 years, all slaves had to be freed. The famous statement found on the Liberty Bell in Pennsylvania, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land," comes right out of this section of the Parsha. It was a central component of the Jubilee year. There are more details concerning slaves and slavery in the Parsha. It was possible for non-Jews to own Jewish slaves or Jews to own non-Jewish slaves. Various laws concerning the ability of these slaves to redeem themselves from their owners are covered. The redemption price depended on how many years are left until the next Jubilee year comes around. The less years, the lower the redemption price gets. This particular section of the Parsha, which is near the end, closes with a general statement about slavery, which seems to give a rationale for the rules concerning slavery in the Bible. Quote, "For the Israelites are slaves to me. They are my slaves, whom I took out from the land of Egypt. I am HaShem, your God." It is unclear how exactly this justifies biblical slavery or how it explains the detailed laws concerning it. But what is clear is the intent of this verse. The Torah is stating unequivocally that the Israelites are God's slaves. But what does that mean? We are slaves to God? Who really wants that? Is this supposed to be a good thing, or is it some form of divine tyranny? The Torah simply leaves this as a finished statement and moves on to the next couple of verses, which are not really related, and then on to the next parsha. Let's see if we can make some sense of that statement that hopefully fits in some way with modern sentiments. We are slaves to God. What if we weren't slaves to God? Would we then be free? History proves otherwise. Slavery in one form or another has always been there. It is still there today, but no longer in the classic manner that everyone dreads. We are slaves to so many things today that we don't even understand that we are tied down with non-physical chains. We are slaves to our passions, to the whims and pressures of our societies, to the gadgets we carry around with us 24 hours a day, to the ideas pummeling us incessantly from all the forms of media we are surrounded with. We may not consider these things to be our masters, and nobody would trade such a form of slavery for bullwhips and iron chains, but they are still controlling our lives to as great a degree as any historical slavery ever did. Is there any liberation from such slavery? The answer is found in this statement in the Parsha. The only liberation could come about when we recognize that we are really slaves to God. While nobody would put it that way today, this is the Bible's way of saying that we have to pick our form of slavery. We can be slaves to others or to social pressure or to our minds and the things that invade it, or we can be slaves to God. Being a slave to God does not mean that one is forever bound and restricted and has no freedom. On the contrary, it actually releases a person from those bonds. It means that one has chosen to lead one's life in a way that fosters awareness that there is such a thing as God, who is intricately involved in our lives and is always lurking in the back of our minds in that region known as the conscience. The 21st century mindset wants to be free of all limitations. Nobody can tell me what to do. I can choose to be whoever and whatever I want. I don't have to listen to anyone. I can feed my mind with drugs or endless games or hopelessness or whatever is coming next down the pipeline. But is that really freedom? Isn't it really a sly and pernicious form of slavery that is so disguised that we don't realize what it is up to? The only escape from that increasingly ubiquitous form of slavery is to become a slave to God. It is a choice, and thus doesn't quite fit into the normal conditions of slavery. It is a choice to set boundaries for oneself and to guide one's life according to what those boundaries delineate. We all have that choice, to be a slave to the world or to be a slave to God. Shabbat Shalom.